Thank you very much. A little bit loud there. Okay. So thank you very much. My name is Jim Davies. I'm currently a Deputy Assistant Commissioner with London Fire Brigade. I was asked by colleagues of NIPV to come along and kind of really give an account of how London Fire Brigade tackled some quite severe weather from last year or last summer, which had dramatic impact really, both on the capital city but also in the wider UK. It wasn't just London that had got to this point. I think what we saw was unique for us, and I think we can learn probably a lot from that. And I think what I'd like to try and do today is give you some account to try and enable others in the room to give some insight into maybe some learning for yourselves. You know, when I say preparation is key to effective response, I don't think I can really amplify that any louder, and hopefully it comes through today. So, as I say, we termed it fire weather, but ultimately what we're talking about is extreme weather conditions. I think we've seen in the last couple of weeks, and I know I've got colleagues here from Italy, the floods that we're seeing at the moment. All of this is extreme weather, and it's unprecedented at the moment, and I think we're going in one kind of direction. And unless we now start looking at that right now, we're going to be absolutely underprepared for when it really does continue to get worse and worse. So last year, as I say, during July, 2 particular days in July last year is really what I'll be talking about. But throughout the whole of the summer, we had really, really sustained heat and extreme weather. So, London itself, for those of you that have been to London or have seen it on the TV, it's a very iconic city. It's also a very wet city. So those of you who have been, you've probably taken your jackets. And that's almost, our perception of it as well. From a subconscious point of view, we were not ready for the extreme heat that we saw. We live day to day under an umbrella. And what this happened was absolutely not the case. So what is London? Like I say, it's the capital city of the UK, which means actually there's huge political pressure in order to make sure it remains safe, and it's also the financial centre of the UK as well. So there's huge amounts of political and financial pressure on maintaining the safety of 9 million residents. It's one of the busiest and most populous cities in Europe. And those 9 million residents are also increased daily by around about 4.3 million visitors, which is a huge reduction, actually. So pre-COVID, that was almost nearly 20 million. So in a city, which isn't huge, what you see is hugely densely populated areas, which is very, very diverse. And I think diversity is absolute key to our success, if I'm honest. The communities are so diverse, but it also brings and presents a problem, because the diversity in the community means we need such wide-ranging and effective communication strategies that will enable us to communicate with that diversity. Somewhere around about 300 different languages are spoken in London. So it gives you some idea of actually the extent of diversity that we're talking about. As I say, the area itself, Greater London has about an area of, just over 1,500 square kilometres, or for Robin, who's actually left, I also put the miles in for him, but unfortunately our US colleague has left. And something which I think I found really surprising for myself. So when I did this original presentation back in Madrid last year, I obviously had to do a little bit of Google to help me out in regards to how London is actually established and set up. And what I found is actually 47% of Greater London is actually termed as green. In my head, it's not. In my drive to work, it certainly isn't. But the 47% of that, when you talk about nearly 50% of your capital city having the ability to burn, then being played out over 2 days, it is quite a shock. So I think what I've also noticed being here, you are very, very green. You know, if you can imagine putting those circumstances into this environment right now, you know, your urban and rural interface is huge. So I think, you know, what ours is pockets of green. I think what you've got is pockets of, you know, of population. So you're actually flipping that thing whole, you know, right on itself. So that's London, and that's, you know, that's a representation of those kind of green areas of London. So as you can see there, you know, there are large areas of parkland. There are, you know, significant areas, particularly around the extremities of rural communities. But nearer the centre, obviously, that gets less and less, with small pockets of, you know, generally the royal areas where they can still maintain the cost of keeping that bit of grass rather than a big high-rise building. So, say that is not your typical picture of London, as I was saying before. Normally it's very grey, huge grey clouds, but occasionally and more often now, this is a typical site now for London and Londoners. And as you can see, that kind of rural interface with immediate layers of densely populated areas is a real problem really for us now. It's great to have it, but we now need to sort of manage that in a completely different way than we previously had to. So, how do we help Londoners remain safe? So the London Fire Brigade itself is, you know, one of the key agencies in London in order to keep London as safe as it is, and that really is our priority. You know, we set out a London safety plan, and that London safety plan's kind of strapline or key objective is being is to be the safest capital city in the world, and to do that it takes resource and it takes a lot of finance. And to do that, so we have nearly 6,000 operational staff in London Fire Brigade, which accounts for about 100. Well, it accounts for 102 fire stations, in addition to a river station. So we also have 2 river boats which, you know, patrol up and down the river. And those 102 fire stations and 6,000 staff, up until those 2 days last summer, had always accounted for a very effective response strategy. Those stations are supported with 142 appliances or fire engines, and those fire engines or pumps, depending how terms you want to call it, are strategically placed all over the capital in order for us to maintain set response standards. And operational colleague, those response standards that we've set out in order to make sure that actually London can respond to the incidents that we've set out within certain times. Generally, on a day-to-day basis, we do it really, really well, which does actually make us the busiest UK fire and rescue service. London's response, we take up about 25% of the whole of the response for the UK, just in London alone. So that's around about 100,000 incidents a year. So it gives you some idea of the extent and the busyness of which is great if you're, you know, a response freak and love going to the incidents. But also, you know, it presents its own problems in regards to how you maintain that level of response 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, even in spike and spate conditions, which is exactly what we saw. So it's also one of the largest fire and rescue services in the world. A lot of fire and rescue services, you know, they are broken down into boroughs, communities, smaller. You know, a country will have potentially, I think one of my colleagues was talking about 180 fire and rescue services in Spain. Was it you said? So you know, just to have that number of smaller fire and rescue services, we tend to, you know, break that down. Now, that largest element in the world also brings a great deal of political pressure, because they pay for that largest fire and rescue service in the world. When you can't then effectively respond as a result of this badge of being one of the largest fire and rescue services in the world, there's a big discussion to be had as to why. So, what we saw. So this increase in wildfire incidents, this isn't unique to London or the UK. And I think what we have seen quite readily now all over Northern Europe, this used to be a central and southern European issue. Your Portugals, your southern Spains. That what we've seen of in the last number of years is that really rising up. And I had a really great conversation last night about tiger mosquitoes. I don't know if you heard about them. Yeah. So yeah, here we go. Yeah. So these things are going to land in London anytime soon. I'm sure of it. So again, something we're not prepared for. So So this increase in incidents, I think we're going to see that continue to see that across Northern Europe, and I think we now very much need to start looking at how we are going to prepare ourselves way better than we previously thought we needed to. And that's probably a key message for yourselves maybe to reflect on, is if that happens in these environments, in your particular environment, I don't think we'd be able to cope with that, if I'm honest. So word of warning. And what that meant, this increased number of wildfire incidents was all around this sustained high temperatures. And traditionally we do not have any kind of sustained summer. We normally pick a day during the summer and we go, there it was. So everybody rush outside, burn up, run back inside and lay cream for a couple of weeks. That's generally our summer. But what we saw, it was an amazing kind of level of sustained temperatures, and that was is typical now in regards to what actually the data is producing. So as you can see, we had a bit of a spike back in the 1700s. I remember it well, and after that we had a bit of a drop off, and then real sustainability about temperatures really. A nice range, and that was typically of what and historically what we're used to. Nice, dry, moist, wet, consistently warm weather, relatively about 9 degrees. For those in Finland, that's extremely hot. But again, around about the 1900s, things started to change a little bit. You could argue, the Industrial Revolution might have had something to do with that. I'm not a climate expert, but what I can tell you is that the data doesn't really, is self-representing. But as you can see here, about 20 years ago, something really did change, and that expedient level of average temperatures, and this is throughout the whole of the 365 days, is on a rise. And what that means is things are staying drier for longer, foliage isn't as green as it used to be, and obviously then limits of flammability are increased hugely. So what has that actually meant? Well, in addition to those sustained higher temperatures, we also saw a lack of rainfall. During June last year, it was the driest June on record. Which means that not only was these are really warm temperatures, but actually everything was tinder dry, and the longer that went on for, the more concerned we were becoming, and that lack of rainfall then had a real impact, not just on our ability to deal with the fires, but also some of the water supplies that we would normally rely on not being there. Now, what happened eventually, in addition to those sustained high temperatures and lack of rainfall, it was almost a perfect storm, where we had the hottest day ever recorded in the UK. And for those in Central Europe, I'm going to apologise. It's like a normal day for you, but at 40.2 degrees centigrade for us, that was an unbelievable. Tarmac is melting on the floors. Buildings are catching fire. This just doesn't normally happen to us. And that accumulation of those occurrences and that hottest day ever recorded saw the busiest day that London Fire Brigade had ever had since the Second World War. So we had received around about 3,500 calls in a 48-hour period. And those who were working in our control, despite all the callback arrangements, they were, to say they're under pressure, probably just doesn't quite do it justice. But of those 3,500 calls that we received, we actually attended about 852 incidents in the 24-hour period. And of those 852 incidents, you know, these were incidents of all types. This wasn't just, you know, fire-related, but we were, because of the type of environment that London is, the highly densulated population, we were seeing many, many more fires of, you know, in industrial units, in domestic premises, anything effectively that, you know, we were not used to having to behave in a certain way that led to fire, generally caught fire. As I say, this accumulation of these incidents, it had a real spike on the 18th of July last year. And what we saw was, in a 6-hour period, were an accumulation of these multi-pump or fire engine incidents. And we call them, we measure our size of our incidents by pump number. So we had one incident which had 30 pumps. We had 2 incidents, all happening simultaneously, these are, over a 6-hour period. 2 at 20 pumps, 3 at 15 pumps, 2 at 12 pumps, 3 at 10 pumps, 4 at 8 pumps, and many other, you know, 6, 4, 3, and 2 pump incidents, all happening simultaneously. Now, to get that level of response, you know, normally we have busy periods. You know, we do have busy periods, and we're used to those busy periods. But that was unprecedented. So we have a really effective tool in our control room, which is a dynamic cover tool. And that's a kind of a graphical representation, what you see there on the right-hand side. And what that does, it enables us to identify potential standby moves. So as and when, you know, we have pockets of activity in London, we're able to then move our appliances wherever, you know, there's a requirement in order to maintain that fire cover that I talked about earlier. So we know that if we have a large incident in the south, we can move some resources down from the centre or from the north in order to be able to maintain these response standards that we do. So it also enables us to say that effective use of resource, so we know, you know, where a resource is going to be used or not used in order to maintain key cover areas of certain parts of London. It helps us reduce risk, evidence the reduction of risk, and also monitor and maintain, you know, that coverage as we need to. So on a typical day, that's probably a very good indicator of actually what London looks like. Pockets of activity where it will flag up areas of red to say actually you're getting near your response times, and that enables us then to, you know, make some areas of cover requirements and movement of resources. At about 2:15 on the 18th of July, that was kind of a representation of that. Now, as you can see, what happened, and it was very well. Depends how nerdy you are, but it was quite interesting to actually watch the response to fires during the day. Now, the sun comes up in the east and it goes down in the west, and we were watching that go across the capital in regards to response. So as the sun warmed up the land, or continued to warm up the land, and it got to its peak, that's when we started to see the fires, and it basically just you know moved across London, which was quite evident. Now, half an hour later, and a couple of more larger incidents, that's what the picture looked like. And then only half an hour after that was the first time that London Fire Brigade ran out of fire engines, which you know was quite a big thing really when your commitment to the Londoners is to be the safest capital city in the world. Now that. If we replay this year what we saw last year, that's more than foreseeable. And we can't have any more than 142 appliances and 102 fire stations because it is already one of the largest fire and rescue services in the world, which poses a bit of a problem. So just a little bit of detail about some of the incidents, just to give you a bit of a flavour and a bit more of an idea of actually what was going on at the ground during that time, and some of the indicators of, you know, what we're now having to look at and think about in a completely different way than what we had traditionally done. So this is a village known as Wellington. It's in the east of London, about 15 miles from the centre. Very rural, as you can see. And that rural and urban interface is really the risk now that we have identified. We need to change our risk management around. So as you can see, very rural, but with pockets of that urban interface and population. Now, I'm sure you can reflect on your own urban environments and what that might look like. Unfortunately, this is what it looked like after the fire. And as you can see there, I'll point some areas out. That is actually one of our fire stations. And honestly, we didn't put it out there and leave the rest to burn. Although, there was some people going, hang on a minute, how did your fire station not burn down when everything else did? Fortunately, we were helped out by the weather. It was all about wind direction. And I think that's one of the key things that I'd probably highlight at this point. Despite all of this, wind direction and speed was very low. Had that have been a different matter, if we'd have experienced the wind speeds that we would normally have experienced, we would not have gotten off anywhere nearly as lightly as we did, and we did not get off lightly. So, I think what we what you see here is, say again, this rural interface here, and once it had got into these sustained high temperatures, like I say, everything was tinder dry. You can see the damage to the premises. The community was. It devastated a community. A whole village had burnt down effectively. What we saw, we lost 19 houses there, complete loss, as well as commercial premises, and many, many more, destroyed and damaged by fire. It's just another picture there. You can see, that, vehicles, whole, areas and complete loss of houses. We had residents trying to help us run hose out. We had commercial premises and agricultural vehicles trying to assist wherever they can. But at that point there, it was absolute last-minute response rather than anything that we could have planned for in that way. One of the commercial premises on the edge of the village itself, as you can see, many vehicles all caught fire, and at that point there, the demand for combustion was greater than the resource we had to extinguish. Only 4 miles away, in another area, at the same time as that was happening, we were then starting to be called to another 15 pump incident and 10 pump incident right next to it, which was one of the incidents which I actually attended, and or two of the incidents which I attended, that is an area called Dagenham, and it's a much more urban area, much more highly densely populated, and you can see these areas of Parkland. The actual fire, where this started, was somewhere down about here. For those who can see me, a little red dot, which is an incident which I started at. But as by the time we got there, that had already gone across that road, and then had started to catch fire in this area here, on the edge of that housing estate. The incident, I say, there were some areas where we were able to actually stop that interface between some of the residential properties. Really, really lucky. That was one of the ones that I turned up to start with. The crews that would work in there, were absolutely on their knees. There was a very limited resources. The amount of physiological and heat, metabolic stress that was going on in all of the firefighters, was again unprecedented. Had gone way above and beyond, what they could do. Many firefighters were taken to hospital with heat stress and heat exhaustion, or treated at scene by London Ambulance Service and paramedics. So that incident, as I say, it had worked its way over that field and into a small commercial premises there, garage and commercial repair shop, which then continued to spread and into what you can see, this small range of houses here. And again, this area here was another loss of 16 houses and commercial areas. The actual, if you can see just over here, other houses, so it actually gone round the back of this, jumped the road into the fences, and then we lost another range of houses here. And we thought actually it's going to keep going into this area here, which was a elderly residential building, which we knew we were going to really struggle with evacuation. So a great deal of our resources and tactics looked at actually what are we going to let burn and what we're going to try and save, and which is a bit of a macro problem when you're used to just saving things. So probably something to highlight at this point there. So if you can see that appliance or that fire engine here, which I've highlighted, just to give you some idea of you know what, because this is all after the event, but this is an incident I turned up to, and to give you some idea of what that actually looked like. This is a photograph that I took when I turned up, and that fire engine that I highlighted a moment ago is that one there. And the reason I took the photograph was because I thought that's the one that we were going to have photographs of at the end of it, because it's the one that's going to be burnt to bits. Flames were literally going through that smoke and over the top of that fire engine at one point. So, one of the real concerns around that particular incident, that car commercial repair shop that I talked about, had a range of cylinders, including acetylene cylinders. Our normal procedure is to evacuate 200 metres. We couldn't, in order to try and evacuate those houses on the other side of the road. So, we were way beyond any standard operating procedure at this point. So we've now got to start to consider what's now standard for us. When standard benchmark moves, then that's the reflection that we now need to start looking at. Just another picture of one of the domestic houses. That ladder there, I was actually on that ladder for a period of time with a hose, which I've not done for many years, but I still think it was a fairly good effort. But as you can see, absolute devastation to these houses. So as you can see, from this left-hand side, that fire had moved round, gone right round the back of that housing estate. That's that commercial building that I was talking about there. That's the fire engine that you saw in the middle. The fire went round the corner, jumped the road, and into those range of houses as well. At that point there, we were asking at that incident for more incident. I know my colleague over there was at another one. They were asking for more appliances at their incident. And in the end, we're going like, I know you want 20 pumps, but you can have 4. Can you deal with that? And we're like, okay. You are at that point there, literally firefighting. So just a bit more of a detail there. As you can see, the amount of devastation. And I think a colleague of mine at this incident had to go and relay that kind of information and that news to the residents. We'd evacuated the residents, to a community centre further up the road. And once we'd got an established idea of, we've got this and we've knocked it all out now, we had to go and then relay that news to the community. And it was as crude, actually, and as devastating as people who live in numbers 14, 17, 19, can you come over here? And told them that was the remnants of their houses, and all of their worldly goods and everything else that went with it. So, what do we know about that now? Now, looking back at that, what lessons have we identified and yet to learn? Because there's a huge difference between a lesson which is identified and then a lesson that is learned. Because until you've done your learning, actually, you've just identified that there's a problem. We're still actually going through that learning phase. We're still putting into place the things that are going to change the stuff that we've identified. So from that, there are 14 strategic recommendations, and they are very wide-ranging, very strategic. So to have 14 strategic recommendations, it's a considerable amount. And from that, there are 68 then high-priority actions. And when I talk about these actions, these aren't like, we're going to add another fire engine. These are, wholesale changes to an organisation, which are going to take many years to implement. We can't do this overnight. But what we do know as a result of that, and the key recommendations and the key identification, is that we need to change our response strategy, because ultimately the risk has changed. So the fact that the risk, we've always known about wildfires, we've always known about extreme heat. We just never saw it in the same level of risk as what we now know it can be. So updating our risk registers to identify those areas of urban and rural interfaces is the first stage of knowing what your risks actually look like. Really understanding, where you need to respond to, where you're going to have water supply issues, where you're going to have that urban and rural interface problems if you have, another period of extreme heat. And that then enables us to review the risk management planning process that falls out of that. So what we've traditionally done and heavily relied on is our effective response, the 102 fire stations, the 147 appliances. All of that, right up until that point there, was ample. Always managed to respond, always managed to generally meet the targets that we met, that we set. Now we know that if this same occurrence happens this time this year, that what we're going to see is the ability not to be able to respond like we did last year, because nothing's changed. The interface is still the interface, the resources are still the resources. So what that means is, actually, we know that the way that we look at risk is completely changed. We've now got to be a lot more around about what prevention matters. And prevention, for us, is key, which unfortunately means, and I think we're going to be talking about it a little bit later on, changing behaviour. Changing the behaviour of our staff, but more importantly, changing the behaviour of the community. Because if without their reliance on them changing that behaviour, what we're likely to see is exactly the same occurrences of accidental fires, and unawareness really of how things need to be able to change the way that we have our barbecues in open areas, the way that we plant certain foliage in certain areas, and that goes on to our protection. So what protection measures can we build into our buildings or around our buildings in order to enable them to be safer if we can't prevent the thing from happening? Now, I think we've talked about some great subjects during these last 4 days that I've been here. And we can talk about some of the things that we have the ability to regulate and legislate against. So we know that if we want to, make a building safer, and I think it was a great example actually about what the difference between compliance looks like and fire safety to a building. One is legal, one is safer, and this is something that you actually can't change. This is something we can't legislate for. We can write to the greater being if we wanted to and say, can you please change the weather? We can't regulate that. We just got to accept actually what is coming. We can predict what's coming, but we can't change it. We can't legislate for this. So these prevention and protection activities are going to be the absolute key to be able to reduce the effect it's going to have on response. Because we know that response just isn't enough anymore. We've got to start to reduce and mitigate the extent of that response before it happens. And then, of course, we've got to look at resilience. And resilience is absolutely key. We thought we had resilience until 2 days of last year. Thank you very much, and any questions I'm happy to take.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Any questions? Over there. He was going to run around to get the microphone wherever it needs to be.
So thank you for your nice presentation. One question, if you're running short on resources with the London Fire Brigade, do you have the option to call in volunteer units or civil defence or something like this?
Yeah, absolutely. The whole of the UK, under legislation, we have certain agreements in law to say that we have to provide mutual aid cover. So mutually, we will assist each other. But as you see there, everybody was under the same conditions. All of the surrounding areas and the Shire services were, when we did borrow resources, in addition to the 102 we had, there were other areas of services that, had more rural equipment that we wouldn't have had because we had never foreseen it. So we were heavily reliant on some of our, partner agencies and other services to come and assist us. but they were under exactly the same problems. You know, I think a colleague there from Catalonia, he talked about, I think it was organisational collapse, and you get to a certain point and you know that actually that is your limit. And I think everybody around us were also at that point of organisational collapse. So it was very, very difficult conditions.
Any more questions?
Jim, thank you. I now understand what you mean with city wildfires. So,
thank you.
Do you have an idea about the fire spread? The cause of the fire spread, was it because of fire brands, the particles, or radiation flux from, let's say, the rural area to the urban area?
It was multifaceted. You know, there were so many different ignition sources. Some of it was accidental. Some of it was ignorance, if you like. You know, people were just still behaving in the same way as they would have behaved normally. You know, taking ignition sources into Parklands, having barbecues outside because the weather's uniquely hot. You know, but what we saw was once the fires had started, was the ripple effect. The amount of brands that were coming off one fire that started the next, that started the next, that started the next. I attended a 20 pump incident the next day in a high-rise building, and on the top floor, on about 28th floor of a high-rise building. Brands had come out of that building, fell into some scrubland that then started, and we thought, oh no, day two. Luckily, we'd managed to stop it, the stuff that had fell out of the building. So, yeah, there wasn't just one cause.
There was a question over there, yeah.
Because of the long drought period beforehand, were there any issues with water resources? Did you have enough water, basically?
London is very well set up for water, because we've got a great river that runs right through the middle of it. You would think. It's not the case. Yes, we had real problems with water. Small areas of what we would have had, we call them emergency water supplies, which is part of our risk information that goes on all of our frontline fire engines. They can pick a map area and they go, identification of an area, we can get some water. They drive there, dries the bone. So we were heavily reliant on what was water was in the pipework, in the hydrant system, and when you start to draw that same system, there's only so much water in those pipes, you start drawing it out in different locations all over London, it soon becomes limited. So, yeah, we had real problems with water supplies.
Thank you, Jim, for your very interesting presentation.
Thank you very much.
I have a question about, when you mention about prevention, protection, that you say that population has a key role. And apart from, I was wondering, what do you ask the population in this case? Which kind of support, response, apart from, not having barbecues on gardens and on hot days?
Sure.
And also, what do you expect from them?
What do I expect? I think it's going to take time. That's what I expect. Changing behaviour is huge. I think heuristic memory is a great impact at the time, but it soon dries up. It soon, reduces that memory of this time last year. And I think people were going to see the same behaviours as we did. What we do ask them, is about changing the way that they act and interact with their environments to try and reduce the number of ignition sources. The protection element of it is to work with landowners, to actually cultivate during the not hot season in order to try and make in, natural fire breaks around some of those rural and urban interfaces, as well as changing the way and the type of plantation that they're putting into the fields. So, foliage that is less likely to burn around those kind of interfaces. So we have a number of boroughs that make up London, so they all have different areas, and those boroughs all have a different borough risk management planning process. And it's those different areas of London that are uniquely different. That it is a very diverse city with very diverse areas. So each of those need to look at their risk independently and work with those responsible people that own the land, as well as the commuters and the residents of London, to try and reduce the likelihood.
Any more questions? Ricardo.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Because I'm of course wondering, because it is predictable that something like that can happen in the Netherlands also. So I was wondering what kind of action did you take to prevent the same happening this year? So of course strategic plans maybe take years, but suppose that you are prepared that it can happen tomorrow.
Yeah.
Maybe we can take over your actions and do them in the Netherlands too.
I'll happily share them. Yeah. So as I said before, those actions are, they're not overnight actions. We know that we've got a big journey about education and changing behaviour. We've got some immediate actions around some of the equipment we've used, some of the identification of risk to understand where it's going to happen better. We're also changing our response strategy in those areas of peak periods. So we're going to have tiers of response where we will reduce certain areas of activity in order to have a higher level of response when these things start to rise. So states of readiness. So as we go through different states of readiness, we'll be more prepared in certain areas based on that sunshine going up and going down. Thank you.
Okay. Still have a question for you, Jim. Did the City Council of London change anything in their politics or in the way they cooperate with the London Fire Brigade by this moment of the 18th of July of 2022?
Yes. Again, the fact that we have the resource that we have and the expectation is really high on particularly fire is what you're going to do better was effectively with what you've got. So yes, there's multi-agency working and improved response standards around London resilience. So there's a group called London Resilience Group, and fire is obviously part of that London Resilience Group. So there are discussions going on about actually our multifaceted approach to this in managing and preventing and mitigating risk. But from a fire point of view, the expectations is we do better.
Buy more cars.
Exactly. I think there's just one more there.
Okay, one more.
Thank you, Jim, for a really nice presentation.
Thank you.
Has this incident, the loads of incidents, changed anything about the communication with the police and the paramedic or the ambulance service and your dispatchers organization?
Yes, but probably not enough. Is the honest answer. We do work. We do have certain protocols working with those other agencies, and in the UK, that's a UK-wide thing. It's a joint emergency services interoperability process or program, so we've historically worked and trained together around large incidents. It actually came out as a result of the bombings in July in London in 2005, which actually put a real requirement for us to work more closely. This is kind of unique to fire, which puts quite an onus on fire to take the lead on it. So really, it was about the extremities of London ambulance service is already under huge pressure, and we saw that. So really, a lot of it's about acknowledgement about actually what we can do or ask of less in order for them to maintain business as usual. So nothing specific, but just generically, we have tried to approach this with an understanding and an empathy really for one another.
Thank you.
Thank you for the nice presentation.
Thank you.
Did you make a comparison with other urban cities and urban areas in Europe? What is typical of the urban area in London?
As I said, really, I think earlier in the presentation, it's the density of the population to the rural interface that we have, which is it's not unique by any means, but it's also that level of diversity of the community that then you need to try and communicate with in evacuations, in supporting areas that where there's greater deprivation, So we know that there's a greater requirement for support in certain areas of London than there are others. So I think that there are certainly cities that are that are very similar to London, and really that's one of the reasons I think Ricardo and NIPV have asked me to come and talk about that, because I think there are probably areas, although not exactly the same, but there is probably some generic lessons here for other northern European cities that you might want to consider, that you might want to look at different ways of doing things. All right, thank you.
Any more questions? No more questions. Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Davies. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, which is not a problem, of course. So we'll be back here at 11:30, and then we're going to listen to Margot Karremaker, and she will talk about behavior, which is very much important. But one of the lessons you all have to take into account: we are all not responsible for the fires, but our experience and the things that we do matter in the way that we make our fire departments, our resurrection, everything that Jim says, work. We can't do that on our own. We have to cooperate with one another, because the challenges we face are too big. Thank you. See each other back 11:30. Thank you.